And I think Iraq was that moment of real overreach in international relations when I think we look back and say that was the beginning of the end of the American domination of the system. If, for example, Russia is allowed to keep eastern Ukraine, that puts in place a precedent that we thought we'd moved beyond in international relations of might makes right, that if you seize territory, you get to keep it. That hasn't been the case for 80 years. Brexit was a huge, huge mistake for the United Kingdom, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is absolutely inexcusable. Cyprus does sit at this very, very complex nexus of various different geopolitical trends. What we're seeing at the moment with discussions over Gaza, it is quite clear that for any European action in Gaza, Cyprus is the natural staging point for doing that. So when, they held up a 20-point bullet plan, points and said, this is the peace plan. No, this is the outline. One would expect to have much, much more detailed conversations about that. We can see the power that someone like Elon Musk now wields because of his ownership of Twitter. And that, he can order the algorithm to be shaped in a way that promotes a political viewpoint. And we've seen his journey into what I think is a very, very dark side of politics and a very worrying side of politics.
James Ker-Lindsay, thank you very much for coming to the first podcast of Politis to the Point. I'm very excited to have you here. Very grateful that you took time to come and see us. I'll give our audience a brief introduction as to who you are. You're an academic, an international relations scholar, specializations on conflict, on statehood, on succession. You've had a focus in the past on the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean, but actually your focus more recently is the world, which you're doing a very good job on. So apart from the dozens of academic books that you've written, the academic articles, you now are also a YouTuber doing fantastic explainers on everything going on in international relations and international affairs, which I absolutely love. They are great for anybody, whether you have a knowledge or you don't have knowledge of international affairs. You've picked conflicts and regional developments around the world and explain them, and we'll talk a bit more about your YouTube life compared to your academic life later. But I just want to say thanks very much for coming on the show. It's really great to have you.
Steph, look, thanks so much for being with you. I mean, we obviously go back a long way, so it was wonderful when you said, look, you're going to start this podcast, and would I be the guinea pig for it? So it's been absolutely brilliant, and looking forward to it immensely.
Great, let's get started then. We'll start with a nice simple question.
Shut up.
So what a whirlwind, right? If we take the Berlin Wall onwards, so much has happened and so much has changed. But I'd like to focus on the 21st century. So the last 25 years. Could you just give us an outline of what have been the major shocks and shifts in the 21st century in international relations?
Well, I'd actually just take it back just a little bit before that to the end of the Cold War and around 1990-91. And for me, I think partly because it was it was a pivotal moment. I was just finishing school, I was starting university, working on politics, and this was such a profound moment. And I think it's very difficult for anyone under their 50s, which sort of aging me very precisely, to really understand that concept of the Cold War and growing up in that sort of environment of this very clear confrontation between East and West. I remember when I was very young, in the late 70s, early 80s, this was a time when we really did think of nuclear war. It was a very real presence in people's lives, and it was a very odd time in that regard. But in some ways, there was a certain stability, if you like, that we knew where things stood, East versus West. And then, of course, we had the end of the Cold War. And I remember, I was in my final year at school when the Berlin Wall fell, and watching those pictures and that awareness of something huge happening, and moving into the 1990s. And we had this sort of real period of optimism that we felt that the world had profoundly changed. The Soviet Union was no more. We were dealing with a world in which the United States was the hyperpower. It was very, very clear that it was in the top position. But it sort of felt that it could solve problems. It was a very idealistic era. And in many ways, I often say that there were two books. And, although I'm an academic, I don't tend to sort of overwhelm people with theory. But there were two books that really did shape the world outlook. And one of them, which, I guess I subscribed to, was something called The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama. And you're nodding and sort of knowing full well where this is going. But this was this sort of very optimistic outlook that's saying, listen, liberal democracy is won. That's it. It's the only game in town. It's not that we're not going to have conflicts, but essentially the rest of the world is going to slowly edge towards that. And then, of course, you had the other one, which was Samuel Huntington and The Clash of Civilizations, which presented a much more sort of pessimistic view, saying that the Cold War is over, that bipolarity of the Soviet Union, the East versus West, is over. And actually what we're going to do is move into a world where, in fact, it's going to be all these different civilizations fighting each other. And he identified all these sort of ones, sort of Christian, Muslim, the Orthodox world as well, which is in a weird sort of subcategory, Buddhist, Hindu. But there was this sort of feeling that we had this can-do attitude that ran through the 1990s. But then, of course, and moving into the new millennium, the big change was, of course, 9/11. And that really did change the world. And again, it's one of these sort of things that's a really strange experience being an academic, that when you're teaching students, each year that passes, each new cohort, different things become beyond their memory that happened before. And 9/11 now, for 18-year-olds going into university, is something that happened before they were born, which it really messes with the heads of a lot of others. Those who are in their 30s sort of saying, well, that's incredible to think that, we're at that stage. But that's exactly it. But it really did transform, I think, international relations in all sorts of ways. We, of course, had that neocon moment, remember them, for those who sort of can remember. That sort of sense of American power. And it's not going to take anything from anyone. It will just step in. If it doesn't like a regime, let's overthrow it. We saw in Afghanistan the intervention that went on there after 9/11, overthrowing Al-Qaeda, overthrowing the Taliban, but of course Iraq. And I think Iraq was that moment of real overreach in international relations, when I think we look back and say that was the beginning of the end of the American domination of the system. And what we've seen since then is this gradual weakening of US position in it for all sorts of reasons we can discuss. A resurgent Russian presence in international relations. Obviously, we saw at the start of the second decade of the millennium when Russia stepped into Ukraine, invaded, sort of that soft invasion that was a prelude to the hard invasion a decade later. But I think so where we really stand is that we went through this strange development from the Cold War, post-Cold War era of optimism that things could be done, American imperial overreach, and then we end up in this situation that we're in today. Well, before we get to Trump, certainly, that things had... It was already looking that the US position in the world was undergoing a transformative change. And now we've got Trump, and it's really difficult to try and make sense of exactly where US power is really going now in many ways, or where the entire international system is going. It's the rules, the systems that we understood for so long, which actually were remarkably resilient from the Cold War to the post-Cold War era, are breaking down. And it really isn't clear where we're going with things like international law, the international system as we stand.
I think one of the things you mentioned, though, it's people born after 9/11, whereas for the rest of us, we remember where were you on the day that. It's one of those defining moments in international affairs. But the problem with new generations coming isn't that there will always be new generations coming. It's what do we remember, right? So how do we absorb history, and how do we remember it? Like, how do we remember wars? Do we see them from a victor-loser perspective? Do we see them from a war is destructive perspective, as in the sheer the immense loss of the world wars is what brought the current international system. It's what birthed it, right? So if you focus less on that, and it kind of creates this sense of, well, war is okay, war's going to happen anyway, so you might as well prepare for it, you know, so maybe you're less aware to try to prevent wars. So the question, that was just more of a comment, but the question I have now is, so, you know, we spoke about that, you mentioned that shift from the American leadership from Iraq onwards. At what point did you realize that Fukuyama was not the right horse to back, let's say? Like, at what point was it the Iraq War that made you think, you know what, I think liberal democracy doesn't have a clear future here?
The reason I'm laughing is because this incriminates me, and it makes me shudder, because, of course, one of the arguments for the neocons was that these were sort of people, liberals, who were mugged by reality. Who had a particular world outlook that was much more of that, and then just realised that, well, that isn't how the world was going to work, and so the US had to be in this dominant position. So I'm a little bit cautious of saying that I'm a liberal mugged by reality. And I think actually for people who sort of know my channel and what I do, they would probably argue quite the opposite. That sort of I'm a liberal who is probably far too idealistic still and believes in things like international law and sort of frameworks of a rule of law internationally. But I think you sort of raise a lot of really great points there. And I mean, your point about history and memory, I think, is so critical. And it's something that, I've been thinking about a lot in recent years, about that passage of time and how that affects our approaches to international relations. If it's a good thing or a bad thing, or both, of course, in the sense that in some ways you're not held back by historical memory. But in other ways, you then find yourself that you don't have that memory to draw on to know about bad things. And I think, one of the things my first real sense of this in many ways was the Brexit referendum. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the breakdown of the different cohorts, the ages that voted to leave the European Union, it was a J curve. So what you actually saw, or I suppose an R curve, if you like, the older people got, the more likely they were to vote for Brexit.
Right.
Until you got to the generation who remembered the Second World War. And they were predominantly Remainers. And I remember my grandmother, who was in her 90s at the time, she'd been a physiotherapist in Liverpool during the Second World War. She remembered the very real effects of the war on service personnel who were returning back to the UK and she was treating. There was a whole generation that remembered that, and for whom it was, the EU was a positive thing because it wasn't the war that they had remembered they'd grown up with. And not only was it the fact that it wasn't the Second World War that they'd grown up with, but they were the children of the people who'd been in the First World War. Yeah. So they'd grown up very much with that. And then you had the baby boomers, the ones born after the war, who grew up in the 1960s, who sort of remembered a Britain that was, at least in their mind, a much more positive place. And it was the Beatles, and it was all that sort of, Britain was super cool on the world stage. And then we joined the European Union in the 70s. And the 70s was a terrible decade. I know I'm going to get all sorts of people who remember the 70s saying, no, it was the best decade ever. No, it certainly, as far as I can recall it, it wasn't. It was a pretty grim time, at least in the UK. So I think you had that generation who looked back to the 60s and equated it with being outside of the European Union. Everything was great. And so that's why I think memory can be so significant in how we shape international relations. And I think this is what we're seeing at the moment with the rise of the far right. We have generations that have absolutely no recollection of the Second World War, that they don't remember the totalitarianism of Europe in the 1930s and 40s and the effects of that. Even the boomers now are dying off. So it's it's really, really interesting to see how much this might be shaped by that sort of loss of historical memory. But I don't know how you can pass it down, or whether, and I think this is the big debate a lot of people are having, are these just lessons that every third generation effectively have to learn from scratch?
Right.
So are we in a completely repetitive cycle that what we're seeing at the moment, for all the horror that we're treating it with, that maybe we just have to go through it and people will see this, and with Brexit, learning the lesson, and it appears that a decade on, people are now seeing, what a disaster it's been. But, or can we somehow persuade people and fight that battle of the narrative, if you like, to explain?
I would have to join you in the optimism ranks and say we have to believe that we can learn, but not without the same mistakes, because otherwise that would involve, 2 world wars and a lot more death and destruction, until we go back to the idea that peaceful cooperation and collaboration among very diverse peoples and states is definitely something worth pursuing. But since we brought up the world wars, you mentioned the victors of the Second World War. They created the international system that has been in place since the mid-1940s. Financial system, international system, the United Nations. Are we seeing the twilight of this Western, and you can call it like Western institutions, Western norms, and from some perspectives, Western hegemony, right?
So, I'd probably start by pushing back a little bit on this idea that it's Western norms and Western hegemony. It is Western hegemony, you're absolutely right. The West came to dominate a lot of these institutions. But I think it's also worth remembering that, a lot of the frameworks of international law were created with direct input from what were then the socialist countries. And also a lot of the critical elements of international law shaping our understanding on things like secession, which is a fairly significant issue. It touches on protecting borders in Africa, for example. A lot of the thinking on that emerged in the 1960s and wasn't the result of Western input. It was the result of input from newly decolonized countries saying that, listen, we might not like the borders that the colonial powers imposed on us, but we recognize the danger of opening those questions and what damage will be done. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a principle that we stick with those borders and that they remain in force. And so I think one of the things I'm finding really disturbing at the moment, especially over Ukraine, is this view that somehow it's the West protecting Western rules. And I think it's been a fundamental failure of Western countries to be able to talk to the global South and say to them, listen, we accept we've done some bad things and that we haven't always lived by those rules. But the rules matter, and that they've been broken in ways now which, if we can't restore that balance, are going to have profound effects on the entire world, and profoundly negative effects. If we start to open up debates about borders, it's places like Africa where that is going to have the most profound effect. We've got about 55 countries in Africa. A lot of those borders could be contested if those countries wanted to. And so saying that if, for example, Russia is allowed to keep eastern Ukraine, that has, Trump was talking about, he's gone a little bit quiet on it now, that puts in place a precedent that we thought we'd moved beyond in international relations of might makes right, that if you seize territory, you get to keep it. That hasn't been the case for 80 years. Are we now starting to sort of see the erosion of that and the consequences that come from it? So I think, and I fully accept the West hasn't always played by those rules. But I think now is really the moment. But, the West has got to take leadership on that. And of course, the West is very divided at the moment because you have Trump versus Europe and various other countries. I think I'd sort of say that, international law, I don't think we should regard it as a Western construct, and I don't think we should regard it as having just protected Western interests. I think that when you look at it, it was actually much more diverse, the inputs that went into it. It wasn't just created in 1945 by the victors of the Second World War. It developed, it evolved, and it has actually served the interests of the wider international community much more in many ways than it served the West.
It's a very interesting and fair point, because I think one of the things that we've seen is that when, with Trump's arrival, I think there was a questioning of international norms. How much do they still stand? How much is he willing to bend them? And my own understanding is that other big powers, non-Western powers like China and Russia, actually maybe got a bit concerned about, hang on a minute, like I know that we're big powers and we will try to bend the rules sometimes to get follow our interests, but by and large we need a system in place, so let's not throw it away.
I mean, the great irony in all of this, and I remember many years ago speaking to a former British ambassador to Moscow, and this probably would have been around 2008, 2009, and we were talking about developments that, you know, Russia sort of recognising the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which came soon after the West had recognised Kosovo, which was a whole issue that, you know, I was very, very worried about at the time. Because I recognised that while I could understand Kosovo's claim to independence, the way that it was done was highly problematic. And I could see that this was going to create problems. And this isn't me sort of saying in hindsight. I wrote a book at the time saying, look, are we really aware of what we're doing here? And this is no personal animus towards, you know, people in Kosovo. I've been many times, you know, it's just because I really did worry about the effects it was having. And I remember that this ambassador sort of saying that what we had to remember is that traditionally Russia was actually an arch legalist when it came to international affairs, because it realised that its real strength lay in the Security Council and international law and leveraging that. And I think that this has been one of the most interesting things that we've seen under Putin, this complete willingness to move away from it. Now, some would say, well, he chose to do this because the West showed that it wasn't willing to play by the rules, and so he just took this to the next stage. Yes, but by God, he's smashed those rules in doing so and created a much, much more unstable world. And so I often take the view that, look, the West needs to understand what it's done to sort of lead up to this, and this isn't for one moment being an apologist for what Putin has done. Anyone who sort of, as I say, watches the channel will know I often say there's two things in this world that I will refuse to take a balanced view on, and that's Brexit and Russian invasion of Ukraine. In both, Brexit was a huge mistake for the United Kingdom, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is absolutely inexcusable. But nevertheless, we need to also look at the steps that paved the way to that, and the changes that took place. I think that, you know, it is a very difficult thing, but and I don't think Western decision makers have really questioned themselves about a lot of this and understood that, and don't necessarily understand how difficult it is then to go to other countries and say, you need to respect international law because it's in your interest, because then they just throw it back and say, well, that's all well and good, but you broke international law on this, that, and the other circumstance. It becomes really, really difficult. And as I say, I don't think, if you were to ask me in many ways, the exam question for many Western foreign ministries is to be able to come up with a credible answer to that. And I don't think they've shown that sort of understanding of steps that the West has done and how that alienated a lot of countries, and has actually made it easier then for Russia to go to these countries and say, look, when the West tells you about international law, they've been hypocritical. And I think that has served that Russian propaganda enormously.
Let's, building on this, let's, for our audience, try to give an understanding, because of these very, very big shifts taking place in the last 25 years. Like, what today, how would you define and identify great powers, middle powers, and small/insignificant powers? and through that, you know, I would really love to hear your view of, can these small powers and medium, I think medium is a bit more obvious, but can these small powers have a role in the agenda, or have any say on it, affect any change?
I think great question, because I mean, nature of power. I mean, I think we still have in our mind a certain tick box list of things that you need to have to be a great power. You know, so you sort of might imagine, well, generally you'd be fairly big as a country. You'd probably have a fairly large population, and you'll sure as hell have a large military. But power seems to have changed in different ways. I mean, so one of the concepts we often talk about in international relations is the concept of soft power. It isn't just military strength, it's about a whole range of other things. It's your diplomatic power, it's your economic power, it's your cultural power that can all have effects. And you know, so one really interesting example that I looked at recently is Qatar.
Right.
This is a tiny country. You know, for anyone, you know, it sits on the eastern flank of the Arabian Peninsula. It juts out into the Persian Gulf. It's got 3 million people, of which only 500,000 are native Qataris. And yet here we see it doing all sorts of things. You know, it was hosting major sporting events. It's got major, you know, museums and art galleries now. It's attracted a number of Western universities to set up there. It's become a major hub for a lot of diplomatic activity. We were watching, well, until Israel decided to bomb it, how it was hosting the talks between Israel and Hamas, for example, over Gaza. These are incredible developments for such a small country. And, you know, obviously it's extremely energy rich. You know, it's got one of the world's largest reserves of natural gas, and it's leveraged that. But also we can look at the United Arab Emirates as well, which has also done very much the same sort of thing. And of course, remembering in Qatar's space, it's got Al Jazeera News Network, which is a hugely influential in obviously the Arab world.
And beyond.
And also, you know, it's air transport links now. It's a major international hub. So it's really interesting. And yet people would come back and say, yeah, but for all that power, where's its army? The fact that it also hosts a major US military base is also something that's worth bearing in mind. But it does actually sort of raise that odd question, doesn't it? Yeah. That ultimately, it might have all these sort of soft power, economic power, but does it come down to the fact that it doesn't command as much military power? So can it truly be powerful? But I think these are really, really interesting debates to have. And of course, you know, we can talk about other middle powers and countries that see themselves in that, in a regional sense. So, you know, I think we'd be talking, you know, South Africa obviously sees itself as a leader in the African continent. I think Ethiopia sees itself in that sense. And, you know, Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa, but it's also one that's riven with all sorts of internal problems. But it's the home of the African Union. It sees itself as a major player. Close to where we are, of course, we've got the question of Turkey and how that sees itself as a major regional actor in all sorts of ways. And I think we have seen over the past 2 decades the way that it's also tried to develop, for example, its presence in Africa, right, and in other parts of the world where it would never normally have had a position. It's started to grow, it's opened up embassies, it's investing in these places, it's sort of reaching out. You know, for example, Erdogan's religious sentiment is coming in and reaching into the Balkans and things. So I think how we understand power definitely has changed. But I think maybe we still do see it primarily in military terms. I mean, it's that very, you know, to use a realist perspective on things.
Okay, so before we go into the region, because there's so much to discuss about the region, I want to stick on this issue and go down to small powers. What would you advise small powers to do in this in the current I don't know how to describe it, but let's say the way the international system is currently working, it has bent international norms considerably. It has questioned multilateralism considerably. So if I was a small state, especially one that's not part of a bigger EU bloc, for example, where you do feel some umbrella of security there. But even within the EU itself, like what can small states do in an environment like this?
So, I think I know where this is going and what you're teasing out here. Look, I think we have to accept that if you're a small state and you want to have a degree of significance, they can't all be like Qatar. I think it's a combination of different things. I mean, I think there's a combination of luck that comes into it. And in the case of Qatar, it's the most important luck of all, which is to have some sort of economic base that is going to make you very, very significant. I was going to say economic resources, but I think another country, which obviously we can look to, is Singapore. And that has been a fascinating story in its own right. I mean, if you look back to Singapore in the 1940s, I mean, it was it's geographically really important where it's located, but it certainly wasn't this sort of economic powerhouse that we see today. It was recognized that its ports could be very influential. But what we've seen is, I think, the other element in it, which is political leadership and political ambition, and recognizing that a vision for a country. And I think in many ways, one could argue this is exactly what we've seen happen in the UAE and in Qatar. You've got political ruling elites and, the Al Thani family in Qatar, which has said, this is what we want to achieve and set a goal for it. I think it's very much what we saw with Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore as well, having a very clear vision. But of course, that raises the uncomfortable question that part of the reason they've been able to do that is because they presided over very authoritarian regimes.
Right. Okay.
So you then get into really troubling questions about, does that sort of very clear, determined vision rely on having political leaders who are unencumbered with democratic processes? And, that is the uncomfortable element that we have to think about with this. But there is that economic luck element. Either you're placed in a fantastic geographic position like Singapore, or you just happen, well, again, fantastic economic position that you happen to sit on huge energy reserves, be that oil, be that gas, or maybe minerals. So I think that unfortunately means, so if it's sort of, can any country have this? No. But I think the other thing is that for the countries that do have that advantage and have that vision, I think, as I say, it's got to be narrowly focused. And I think, it's also working out where a comparative advantage lies.
Right.
Not trying to do everything, but just simply saying, right, okay, where can we really excel? And that, I think, is where we're sort of getting onto probably what we're talking about, which is, in Cyprus, which sits in a very, very interesting position, but whether it can translate that. And I think in many ways, the natural advantage that, a country like Cyprus has is that location being that link between Europe and the Middle East. And I think that this is what I found really interesting, is that, and I've sort of seen it with other countries that have joined the European Union, they sort of reject their natural geographic home because they want to be part of Europe, but then start to realise that actually that natural geographic home is what can make them particularly valuable to Europe. So, the other example I often draw on is Slovenia. So when it joined the European Union, it would say, we want nothing to do with the Balkans. It's not our problem. It's a complete basket case, nothing to do with us. We're central, and we're sort of like a bit Germanic. It's bad to say, maybe I shouldn't. But anyway, there was a thing that sort of saying, to paraphrase it in polite terms, that the Slovenes are the sort of the product, the illegitimate product of a Slavic mother and a Germanic father. And it definitely tried to lean into that sort of, but then realised that in actual fact, where its advantage in Europe was in many ways, was that bridge to the Balkans, being able to explain it. A little bit watered down now that Croatia's in there, but it was really interesting to see. And I think in some ways, for a country like Cyprus as well, it's that clear link with the Middle East, this very troubled, problematic region, and yet Cyprus is essentially, geographically has often really been much more in the Middle East than Europe. I know people sort of might push back against that, But I think it now recognises that that's where its real advantage lies. And I think it's been recognised by Europe. I mean, I often sort of talk about when Christos Stylianides was made European Commissioner for Cyprus. Prior to that, it was things like consumer affairs, it was healthcare, soft subjects. He was brought in for humanitarian aid, crisis management, and that was a very, very clear. That came after the 2006 crisis in Lebanon, and it was a real reflection and understanding of Cyprus's important role for that. So I think, in certain cases, again, it's the luck of geography. Right. But for somewhere like Cyprus, it's that link with the Middle East, which I think has been recognised by political leaders as being so essential.
So it's also about how you frame the position of the country. I've heard you describe Cyprus as being the EU's Middle East outpost, right? Not the Southern Europe flank, but more about the outpost in the Middle East. So you spoke about the advantages that brings Cyprus, but also disadvantages. It is a very, very volatile region, as we have seen, and vulnerable to war, conflict, migration flows. And going back to what we said earlier, the region is dominated by strong men, but strong as in, as in characters that take very, very clear stance on issues such as Netanyahu, such as Erdogan, and Trump, who's now quite involved in the region. What can we take out of the latest developments involving all three? I mean, obviously, we are based in Cyprus and we watch, but we also feel very close. So it's quite concerning. Do you think that the influence of these strong leaders who, with that strength, there also comes, sparks that fly off, missiles, conflicts. Is this something that we should be worried about?
Well, I think obviously people here in Cyprus are naturally very worried about what's going on in the region, and I think it works on two different levels. So, for example, we saw earlier in 2025 when it was Israel and Iran were at war with each other, you could see the missiles being shot down from Cyprus. It was incredibly close. And that really, I think, probably brought home for a lot of people in a very real way what was going on. That, if you look at a map and see where Cyprus lies, how close it is, from you leave from the eastern coast of the island, your next stopping point is going to be Syria. It really, really does sit on the Middle East doorstep. Israel is incredibly close as well. I mean, a flight is 45 minutes to Israel from Cyprus. It's 35 minutes to Lebanon. It really, and I think sometimes it's very difficult, and where often, you're standing on the south coast, you look south. I mean, it's Egypt is your next stopping point. So I think Cyprus does feel very much in there, but I think also you bring up that really interesting point about Israel and Turkey. And, I remember when I first became interested in the Eastern Mediterranean and worked on Cyprus, of course, it was a very different era. Israel and Turkey had a very close relationship. In many ways, the 1990s were the golden age of that relationship. Remembering Turkey was the first Muslim country to recognize the state of Israel. It had exceptionally close relations, especially, as I say, in the 1990s when they had defense cooperation. And that has all now collapsed. And there are very, very real tensions between Turkey and Israel. There is clearly no love lost between Netanyahu and Erdogan. Erdogan has often now presented himself as being, the scourge of Israel, and he's sort of bringing this up in very, many Islamic meetings and regional meetings. That even trying to encourage other Muslim states to come together to attack Israel. And so it sort of creates a really odd dynamic because, of course, Cyprus is sort of caught between the two, not politically, obviously, with the division of the island, but certainly sort of feeling that Turkey lies immediately to Cyprus's north, and then you've got Israel, which effectively lies to Cyprus's southeast. And I think part of the danger is that, we also live in a world where things like social media, can shape narratives and a bit of scaremongering. So one of the things that, I think, we've probably both been seeing is sort of discussions of, well, could Cyprus become the proxy battleground for Israel and Turkey? Or is Israel going to help, Cyprus liberate the north and things like that? I mean, it's really going into quite strange territory in that regard. So I think, there are two parts of this debate. There's sort of the real element of, where things stand. And yes, Cyprus does sit at this very, very complex nexus of various different geopolitical trends. But there is also this sort of rather more exaggerated, so overemphasized. But again, I come back to the point that, what we're seeing at the moment with discussions over Gaza, it is quite clear that for any European action in Gaza, Cyprus is the natural staging point for doing that. It's the natural coordination point for doing it in a very physical sense of, ships that would need to go out or, airdrops or whatever can be done much more easily from Cyprus. So I think in that sense, it becomes really, really interesting to see where things are going. And Cyprus certainly plays an important role in that.
Technically, that gives it some capital, let's say, to be able to use its role to be able to be the friend of all in the region. And yet there's also a worry that the militarization of the region can put it in a negative role as well.
Well, I think, Cyprus has always tried to be very careful in how it's approached its dealings with the region. And it has been fascinating to see how that's evolved because, of course, yes, Cyprus these days has a very close relationship with Israel. And there have been questions. I remember that there was at some point talk that Hezbollah had threatened Cyprus. Now, the debate about exactly what that was about, whether it was about the British bases or whether it was about the Cypriot government's position on having close relations with Israel, and reports that Israel was doing training in Cyprus. Israeli forces were cooperating with the Cyprus National Guard, that they were doing training exercises in the mountains, which were roughly very similar to the mountains in Lebanon, and so that was how Israel was getting its training for if it wanted to do anything up in, in Lebanon. And I thought that did bring a certain amount of attention, but also, I mean, Cyprus has had a fascinating relationship with the broader Arab world, and remembering, I mean, it's quite complex. So again, when I started looking at Cyprus, it was very much Cyprus had very good relations with its Arab neighbours, partly because it was a numbers game. So Turkey had a very good relationship with Israel, so that meant that Israel was not going to be a good partner for Cyprus, but also for things like General Assembly. Whenever the Cyprus issue came up, Cyprus wanted a number of votes. It was a member of non-aligned movement, it was a member of Commonwealth, and it also tried to have this very good relationship with many Arab states. It had very good relations, for example, with the Palestinian authorities and things, which was always really fascinating. But we have seen a certain amount of change on that. Yeah. Again, partly because of the relationship with Israel. But it's not been perhaps as dramatic as it would have been 20 years ago, because, of course, more and more Arab states, although obviously things are strained at the moment, have established relations with Israel. And what I think we also notice is that there's been a little bit of a shift from that sort of Near East relationship to the Gulf states, that Cyprus is definitely trying to cultivate its relationship with the Gulf Arab states, with the UAE, with Qatar, with Kuwait, with Saudi Arabia, the wealthier countries. We've seen official visits. It's very, very clear. And perhaps some of the other countries aren't quite as significant in thinking these days as they once were. But it's certainly a fascinating relationship and not necessarily easy to decode.
I think last question on the region. Do you think the Gaza peace will hold?
Look, I mean, if you come at it from how we usually approach peace processes, this, and I was speaking with a very dear friend of mine, who's a professor of peace and conflict studies, And we were having a long chat about this the other day, and it was we both agreed that how the Gaza deal was reached certainly doesn't conform to what you would usually expect on all sorts of levels. One, it didn't involve negotiations with the parties themselves, or certainly didn't involve negotiations with Hamas, or more generally the Palestinian leadership. It might have involved a degree of negotiation with Israel. I mean, it's not to say there was no negotiation with them, but it was done via proxies. So the United States would have been communicating, whether that was Witkoff or Kushner, were communicating with partners, whether that was Qatar, for example, and Qatar obviously is very influential over Hamas, to get that point across. But it didn't conform to a normal peace process in terms of who was round the table or how it was being done. But it's also very light on specific detail. So we can talk about the 20 points, and a lot of those 20 points were things that I think any of us who works on conflict resolution would have said should be there in one form or another. But it was incredibly light on detail. If you look back at other peace processes, and, you know, for example, look at Cyprus or Northern Ireland, the plans are incredibly detailed when they're put out, you know, and people then say, oh, but it's too complex for us to understand. Yes, because you have to examine lots of eventualities, and you say, you know, what would happen is when parties around the table are saying, well, look, we can accept the principle of a security force. All right, fine. So that's a bullet point. But what does that mean in real terms? Who's going to contribute to it? Who's going to pay for it? What mandate is it going to operate under? What are going to be status of forces agreements? How would you bring in material and equipment? If Gaza, for example, hasn't got a runway on its airport, where's that equipment going to land? Is it coming in by sea, or could it be landed in Egypt, or could it be landed in Israel? If it's landed in Israel or Egypt, these are sovereign states. They have their own customs procedures. You know, all of these things. Peace plans are detailed and long because you've got to think of all the eventualities. And even then, things will crop up that aren't there. So when, you know, they held up a 20-point bullet plan, you know, points and said, this is the peace plan. No, this is the outline. One would expect to have much more detailed conversations about that. So you can say, right, okay, it's stopped the fighting. We've seen hostage releases, which is fantastic news. But each of those 20 points is now going to have to be subject to very, very considerable negotiations. And how's that going to be done?
Did that happen in the summit that we just saw in Sharm el-Sheikh, or was that more of a celebratory round?
It was very much a celebratory round. I mean, you know, this is getting to nuts and bolts, you know, so, and we're already starting to see the consequences of it. So they said, right, great, we're going to hostage release as the first step. Israeli troops pull back. Great move. But we've already seen the reports that all that's meant is that Hamas fighters have come from wherever they were up and are reasserting control in Gaza again. And the fear is that this will then provide the pretext for Israel to say, or Netanyahu to say, well, this is not what we wanted. This just shows that Hamas continues to be an existential threat to us. We're going to continue. So is it going to be a question that's going to break down the talks? So what you would have expected is at the same moment that Israel was withdrawing its troops, you would have had in place an international security force that would have gone in there and carried out absolutely immediately, and started carrying out policing and military functions, you know, proper crowd control, making sure that Hamas didn't start to take control in Gaza.
So just to be clear, in terms of international relations practice, in past conflicts and the urgent need to bring peace to a very deadly conflict that has brought untold bloodshed to the region, it would still require these details to be ironed out before you're able to actually stop the conflict, because otherwise what you have is essentially you're starting with 20 tweets which summarize what we want to achieve, and then work out the details later.
I mean, look, so there's different schools of thought. You've got a lot of people who would say, listen, we need to stop the killing. And that's got to be the priority. Yes, absolutely. But we now see the problems that have got to be sorted out. And is this going to be a permanent ceasefire now, or are we just in a hiatus where both sides will regroup, Hamas will regroup, Israel will regroup, and we will just simply see a return to fighting in a matter of days, weeks, months? Or if we can't sort out the question of a Palestinian state, years. Because, I'm just trying to recall who was saying it, but, certainly when I was driving here to listen, and somebody was pointing out that, I think it was, I think it was the King of Jordan. I was about to say King Hussein of Jordan. It's King Abdullah. My God, that's just aged me. But it pointing out that you're not going to have a real settlement until you address the question of a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
So, and that is absent from this 20 points. I mean, I think, part of it sort of hints at some sort of eventual political settlement.
At the end, yeah.
But that's going to have to be on the table, and probably sooner rather than later. And, I've also got my concerns about where we're going on that. And I think part of the worry I have is that with all the focus on Gaza now, the West Bank's going to be forgotten. And I think we've traditionally thought of a Palestinian state as being essentially based on the West Bank. Could we now be seeing a shift towards saying, well, Gaza will become like maybe eventually a Singapore-type city-state that exists there, whereas West Bank just gets completely annexed by Israel. And remembering, of course, that the International Court of Justice, the world's highest legal body, has said that Israel is effectively annexing the West Bank. We need to address that issue, because that is also going to be central to all of this. So there are some really, really big gaps in this. It's not just the end stage gaps of where this is all going, but it's the immediate here and now on things like security. Who's going to be the executive for this? And it's no good saying this is going to be Trump sitting as chairman and you're going to have Tony Blair on it. Who's going to be on the ground? Who are going to be the civil servants staffing this? Who are going to make sure that electricity is functioning properly, clean water, starts to coordinate the rebuilding of Gaza. 90% of it has been flattened. That is a lot of schools, hospitals, roads, houses that have all got to be rebuilt. Where's the money coming from? Another big issue. America probably won't be paying for this. Israel has said it certainly won't be paying for all of this. Do the European countries, are they going to put forward the money? Are the Gulf states? All of these are the sorts of things that you would expect to have been fleshed out in much more detail, so that when the fighting stops, you immediately start to move in, stabilise the situation, make sure that you could administer it properly, and you've got the money there to start rebuilding.
So definitely a very precarious situation, and there's definitely a lot of let's wait and see how it pans out. I'd like to switch to another topic very quickly. It's about social media.
Okay, all right.
I would like your opinion, because you have shifted from academia, although very much still an academic, but from spending months and years writing books and articles, you are now part of the welcome to the news cycle. You are now part of the cycle. Like you are putting out these fantastic explainers on international affairs, which is obviously something that comes up a couple of times a week, and also part of the promotion of that is on social media, where you are very much, and to your credit, engaged with your viewers as well as comments, replies to comments. And I think it's amazing that an international relations channel that actually explains and tries to maintain a balanced approach to the facts is so popular, because what we're seeing on the other side of the coin is the opposite of that. It's, let's just summarize everything in 140 or 80 characters and forget the nuances, put it out there and bait those clicks, so that has changed a lot of the narratives, and I think the popularity of your channel shows that there's still a hunger and a need for some kind of information that people can find credible without having to agree to it, But what do you think social media has brought to international relations? Because it's made up of states. States are made up of people. Whatever we say, democratic, authoritarian, people have an influence on state policy. right? So how has social media affected international relations?
Oh gosh, where to start? I mean, I think, so you can take it at a policy level. One of the things which obviously has been really fascinating with social media is the way that it has connected people. So I am extremely critical of the way that it's gone. Like many other people, I won't use Twitter anymore, or X, or whatever we're calling it these days. I came off it. Was absolutely appalled at what it had descended into. And I'll be quite honest, I don't think there is any justification for anyone to be on there. And it worries me that, governments and things like the European Commission still have a presence on Twitter. I think, they should be coming off it. If I'm to be really, really brutally blunt about it, I don't think that, and I know the argument that you're contributing to the debate and you've got to have the other side of the issue. No, I think it's gone so far beyond that it's not helping now. You're not serving a purpose. And I know it's probably going to be an unpopular opinion in many people's minds. But
well, we might actually share this podcast on Twitter. So can you elaborate though for our viewers, like why? What's gone so bad? Because not everybody's aware of what's happening.
Well, I think one's timeline now is just full of things which are just incredibly unpleasant in all sorts of ways, and whether that's views, whether it's images, it's just collapsed essentially. I went onto Twitter at a time when it was an incredibly useful source of information, and it was very collaborative. It was tended to be friendly. All right, everyone has their arguments on it and everything like that. But what was also so interesting, coming back to your original point, was that it very often allowed you to have conversations with significant figures in your field. Yeah. So that could be not only other academics, but it could be policymakers, it could be journalists, that you'd interact with them, that, you'd follow them, they'd follow you, you could have DM, just bring things up. And it was incredibly powerful. That it gave you that level of immediate interaction.
Right, okay.
So I was a huge fan of social media for what it's done, but I do see the effect that it's taken now. And I think, the rise of the right, so before anyone sort of jumps in, because, it's very easy to just accuse people and pin labels on it. So as soon as I start talking about right, then everyone pins me as a sort of a lefty. I'm not. I've always seen myself as a militant centrist. Okay. I don't believe in taking one particular viewpoint on dealing with social issues, for example. I've always sort of, I often will cast myself sort of a bit facile and everything, but I think it gets the point across. I'm about as far left as you can be and still get away with wearing a pinstripe suit, which is one of the things that, I don't wear suits terribly often these days, but certainly when I was living in London, that would be very much how, I would describe myself. No, very much a centrist. Okay. I believe in social democracy. I believe in making sure that people who are less fortunate will have proper education, proper healthcare. But also I believe that, we have a responsibility to respect taxpayer, the contributions that taxpayers make, not be wasteful in that spending. So thinking very seriously. So that's very much the way that I've been informed on, if you like, a political viewpoint.
Okay, a centrist viewpoint.
A centrist viewpoint, but it also carries over into international relations. So I remember many, many years ago when I was doing my PhD, I was writing about non-alignment, and I sort of said, it doesn't take a position. I remember my tutor at the time sort of saying, well, you know what, but that's neutrality. Non-alignment is something rather different. It's judging the merits of each individual case. Okay. So coming into an issue, and this is something I really do try and carry with me, and I try and carry it with me in the video. So it's not necessary to take a completely impartial view on a situation. And remembering, I've already said to you, there's two things I will not be impartial on, which is Brexit and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But on most other things, I do try and take a step back and look at it and recognize that there are two sides to this. But if I believe that one side is compelling, I'll call it as such. Okay. Likewise, when I look at a situation, if I think that one side has done something that's praiseworthy, we should recognize that and not be afraid to recognize, and speak up about it. Likewise, if the next day it then does something which is completely counterproductive, to be able to say as much. So that each new day, if you like, is a new situation, and let's judge if one side is contributing or taking away from efforts, for example, to get peace.
Okay.
So I think, I think it's really, really important to come at it like that, rather than nail colours to a mast and say, right, okay, so if you're looking at the Israel-Palestine situation, everything that Israel does is bad and everything the Palestinians do is good, or vice versa.
Right.
That just doesn't help deal with situations internationally.
So do you think social media actually, the nature of social media is not open to nuances?
No. In a word, no, it isn't. And I think, look, the big thing I think as well that, I often say to people, I think what really worries me, and I've thought about it a lot, and it is a real struggle to do. It's very easy with social media to get drawn in and say something that's just a bit edgy on the one occasion, and then you suddenly get a bit of adulation for it. And I've seen it happen to too many people. And then they say, oh, I like that attention I'm getting, and I like the praise that I'm getting, even if it's not from people that I would usually want to get praise from. I'll do it again.
Right.
And before you know it, and I think we've seen this far too many times, with political figures as well, who've absolutely sort of loved that adulation. So one of the things, I often say now is I think that this has become the ultimate test of character in the social media age, that you can resist that temptation to start making and taking positions which I don't think are morally defensible,
right,
in the name of getting that adulation.
Would it also be, could we coin it, if someone hasn't already, something like SEO-friendly political positions? Search engine optimization friendly?
I don't think it's even sort of search engine. I think it's you're getting adulation from a particular group, and the thing about sitting in the middle is that it hopefully allows me to come in and take a very balanced view on situations. But invariably, what it means is that you just get stuff chucked at you from both sides.
Right.
So, and I find this. So, for example, you do a video on India, Pakistan. That is about as close to a no-win situation as you're going to get to. Try doing a video where you have to put up a map.
Right.
And you're dealing with India and Pakistan. It's impossible. You're going to get it from one side or the other. So looking at Russia, Ukraine as well, I mean, that, as I say, I don't take a balanced view quite openly. But I think, what we see is that the tendency then is to take just one side on lots of different issues and make a name for yourself, and then just get a huge following, because everyone who likes that and likes to hear that says, yeah, I want to hear what this person has said, because they're reinforcing what I want to say. I think taking that centrist position, that non-aligned, not neutral, non-aligned position, where you're willing to take a position on things, but not just say, I don't have a position. Right. You take a position, but it might not be popular. It means that you're not going to necessarily get that sort of the same number of views as the people who are taking a clear position one side or another. But I like to think that there is a space for that, and I like to think that there are a lot of people out there who do want to sort of think about what's going on in the world and not resort to very polarized positions on whatever conflict that I might be looking at. I wish there was more of it. Mm-hmm. But it is difficult, and it's and things like YouTube are incredibly difficult to get into in many ways. I mean, in some ways it's quite easy. You can even do it on your phone these days. But it's a very, very steep learning curve for people. I mean, you're starting to learn about principles of lighting, sound, videography. It's writing scripts. It's then learning all the editing software. It was an incredibly steep learning curve for me when I started. And then, as I say, it's building up a bit of a name from there because you're coming on sort of fresh into it. Incredibly worthwhile in other ways, though. I love doing the channel. Yes, I get a fair amount of abuse. But also, you point to the fact that I love to engage. I think that's really the academic in me. I still see this as about learning and teaching, interaction.
Yeah.
And I love that side of it. So I love talking to people, and I learn so much as well. When I cover a situation and somebody from that country or that region then chimes in and says, listen, thanks a lot, and I'm more than happy to take criticism if it's framed in a polite way. I mean, what's not nice is when people just sort of become really abusive. But a lot of the times people will say, listen, I really liked it, but on this issue, I take this view on it. Okay. And it becomes a really great way of learning. And I think that also helps the other viewers who are reading through the comments. So I often say to people, write an abusive comment, all right, it'll get either deleted by YouTube or by me if it's really offensive. But you've not contributed to the discussion, whereas somebody who comes in who might disagree, but does it politely and lays out why they think I've made a mistake or I'm wrong, that actually helps the debate. And I love those comments.
Right.
So I think really, really helps with things.
The good and the bad of our new world. I would like to end this really, really fascinating conversation on one last question. Since we are talking about international relations, how much should we be also talking about corporate relations? And how influential, very powerful, large corporations with much bigger, let's say, countries don't have this kind of GDP or influence, and you can go from Silicon Valley to other companies. But how much are corporate relations or corporate interests or shareholder interests trumping issues of citizen interests or even sovereignty?
I was smiling as you were asking, not because it's not a serious question, but I was smiling because the answer is going to delve into territory that my wife has told me I'm not to talk about. Partly not because it's somehow obscene or whatever or crackpot, but just simply because I will bend people's ears on it. But I'll get to that in just a second. I think it's hugely important. We've just been talking about social media. We can see the power that someone like Elon Musk now wields because of his ownership of Twitter. And that, he can order the algorithm to be shaped in a way that promotes a political viewpoint. And we've seen his journey into what I think is a very, very dark side of politics and a very worrying side of politics. So I think, yes, we need to be aware of it. But the point that, that I said that I had been told not to talk about is because I am a huge believer in something called universal basic income, which I'm sure many viewers will be aware of. But for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, this is essentially the idea that everyone would be given a certain amount of money each month. And it's not means tested, everyone gets it, and it provides a basic standard of living for people. Now, what's really interesting is many people immediately recoil from that and just say, that's communism and everything. No, it's not, because you're perfectly entitled to earn more money on top of that. I mean, no one's going to stop you, and it encourages entrepreneurship. But I think that we also have to recognize, and this is becoming a huge problem. This is something I've been interested in for at least a decade now. And I spent many years at London School of Economics, and there was a group there, and quite a large group of academics there who would regularly meet to talk about universal basic income. And it actually unites the left and the right, because there's a lot of people on the left who say, listen, we need to provide standards of living for people. And that's becoming a huge problem now with AI, that we are really on a cusp of a world where a lot of jobs are disappearing. And I know that people always say, oh yeah, but we've had this debate before and there's always new jobs that are created. Yeah, all right, there will be people who are writing prompts for AI, and that is a vital skill that school kids need to learn. But the reality is this will affect a lot of employment. But we've already been seeing it. I mean, things like banks. I remember growing up, you go into a bank, you'd have all the tellers there, and it was a small army of no one now. It's all done online. What happens to all these jobs that are disappearing, which aren't necessarily being replaced? Interestingly, on the right, there's been an understanding of this because they understand that there are a lot of people who need social security of some sort or another. And the current system of tax credits and universal payments and unemployment benefit and pensions is extremely complex and very, very costly to administer. So you've actually got some very interesting voices on the right who say this is actually about government efficiency. Governments can save huge amounts of money by just simply saying to everyone, here's the money you're getting this month. That would replace unemployment benefit, would replace pensions. You might, I think, take into account people if they've got disability, that they would, that would be a category that you would probably give a little bit more to for reasons that, and I'm very aware of, disability rights from my own personal family situation, how important this is, and how costly it is for people with disability. So you might want to give more, but essentially it's a flat rate that you give. And I think that it would offer up opportunities, especially with the way that the economies are going at the moment. And the thing is, sort of people who would pay for it, well, you'd have to essentially increase corporation tax. And people say, oh, but companies won't accept that. Okay, fine. Companies are making people unemployed because they're changing their productivity. They're moving to AI. That's all very well and good, but that will consume them eventually. Because who's going to buy their products if you haven't got people who are gainfully employed and earning money to buy that stuff that they're producing? So they need to start thinking. So we really, really do need to have a fundamental rethink of, the whole economic system. We are moving into a very, very different world. Now, you can take the dystopian view of it, where, you sort of look at the films where you've got high rises in LA full of super rich billionaires and then sort of slums around it. Or, I'm going to give this away, you can take the Star Trek view of things. And I have been accused by people on my channel, or praised, I'd like to think, for taking a very sort of Star Trek view of the world, where we actually find a much better world because we recognize, that how we deal with things like consumption, how we deal with employment, how we deal with income, and make it much fairer and more distributed. And that's where, again, it sounds very left, but I think you can also construct a very strong right-wing argument for this. And as that centrist that I am, I think both sides have really got compelling arguments, but I think it's something that we definitely need to be thinking about. So you talk about the role of corporations and do we need to be worried? Yes, but it goes far, far deeper than that.
I think the biggest risk that comes to my mind there is that making sure UBI doesn't make people consumers and defines them as consumers, that people still have that sense of purpose and that ability to...
I'd say it does more of that, because if you're freed from that concern and you've got a regular income coming in, people can find expression in other ways. So many would say volunteerism is facilitated by that. Again, it doesn't stop entrepreneurship. It doesn't stop people from going out and earning their own money. That's absolutely, you create a very different type of economy that I think comes from a much more positive type of economy that recognizes where AI is producing advantages to dealing with a lot of stuff that, frankly, people for generations have gone out and led pretty miserable lives having to do certain jobs which are very rote, which, there's a wonderful academic at LSE called David Graeber who wrote about bullshit jobs. And I don't know if you ever saw this, but it really, it's fantastic to read. He just realized that there's whole classes of people that you could say to them, if you made these people unemployed tomorrow, what difference would it have made? They're doing things that don't really need to be done. And this is soul destroying for these people, to be stuck in these jobs. AI offers the possibility of being liberated from that. And yes, the very negative view would say, oh, well, everyone's just going to sit at home on their couch playing, video games. And it was actually rather interesting. What was it? EA, Electronic Arts, the other day, its share price or something had gone up because they're banking on the fact that AI is actually going to do just that. Okay. That people are just... I like to take a more positive view and say, and I'm not against video games, by the way. I have been known to game myself, but I think it does allow people to do other things. Volunteerism, artistic pursuits, entrepreneurship, people realizing what they wanted to do and not constrained by the fact, it's not just sitting on home, and doing it. I think we open up very, very much more positive avenues for an economy. But it is, I know there is those who will be looking at this thinking that's terribly utopian, but the reality is we need to be thinking about it because, I've got children who are at school at the moment. I do genuinely worry, like most other parents I'm talking to, what's the world going to be like for them? And I know they would say, but this has been every generation, but I really think that we're standing at the cusp of something very different now.
I agree on that, and I'd like to end on this positive note, utopian or not, that you've given us. I just want to say thank you for a very sweeping conversation. I didn't expect to end up on UBI, but the Universal Basic Income, but it's been absolutely fascinating. Professor James Ker-Lindsay, thanks so much for being our first guest on the show.
Steph, thank you so much. It's been brilliant. We've known each other for a long time, so it was a wonderful chance to have a long chat.